The Widow, Episode 08. The large, ominous moon watched Isabella. Her heart, an iceberg in the desert, began to crack. A year after the death of Ricardo, the love of her life, she finally felt something. A strange warmth near Daniel, a man as kind as he was mysterious. But the shadow of the past was long and menacing. The possessive gaze of Gustavo, Ricardo's brother, who always secretly loved Isabella, promised a storm. Would this new love, as delicate as a newly opened flower, be destroyed before it could even bloom? Danger approached, silent as a snake ready to strike. Isabella was in a dangerous game, and with each step the stakes got higher. The night in Acapulco was a dark veil embroidered with bright stars, but for Isabella there was only darkness. The moon, a large ball of cheese in the sky, seemed to peek from behind the palm trees, a silent witness to her fragility. A year since Ricardo, her beloved Ricardo, had passed away, leaving an immense void in her heart, a void she swore never to fill. A year of mourning, of loneliness, of a heart turned to ice. But something was different. A strange warmth, a hesitant flame, was beginning to melt the glacier that was her heart. That warmth had a name. Daniel. Daniel, with his dark eyes as deep as the ocean, his smile that illuminated everything around him, his voice that soothed like a lullaby. He was the opposite of Ricardo, calmer, more mysterious, an enigma that Isabella found herself increasingly tempted to unravel. Daniel made her laugh, made her forget, even for a few moments, the excruciating pain of loss. He looked at her in a way Ricardo never had, a way that made her feel desired, loved, alive. And it was this feeling, this strange feeling of rebirth, that both frightened and fascinated her. But Ricardo's shadow remained. Not only the memory of the man she had loved with all her might, but also the menacing presence of Gustavo, Ricardo's brother, a man who had always loved her in silence, in secret, a dark and possessive love that now seemed to overflow. Gustavo was the personification of the approaching storm. His dark eyes, full of restrained anger, followed Isabella like a hungry wolf, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He couldn't accept that the woman he desired was in the arms of another man who wasn't him. While Isabella took a bubble bath, the scent of jasmine filling the bathroom, the image of Gustavo invaded her mind like a nightmare that wouldn't let her sleep. Gustavo's love was different. It was a toxic, suffocating love, a love that imprisoned her, a love that was as intense as it was frightening. She felt his gaze burning on her, even when he wasn't around. Her skin prickled at the memory of their chance encounter at the supermarket, the accidental touch of their hands, the electricity that ran through her body. An electricity that wasn't the soft and comforting warmth of Daniel. It was a tremor of fear, the adrenaline of danger. Isabella knew she was playing with fire. The newborn romance with Daniel was a delicate flower, a fragile bud that could be crushed at any moment. Gustavo's intense passion, on the other hand, was a dormant volcano about to erupt. She felt divided, caught between two worlds, the sweet promise of a future with Daniel and the mortal threat of Gustavo's blind fury. It was as if she were on a tightrope, with each step, the abyss getting closer and the balance getting more and more tenuous. Night fell over Acapulco, the city transforming into a labyrinth of shadows and shimmering lights. Isabella, however, was trapped in her own labyrinth of emotions. Daniel had sent her flowers, a bouquet of white orchids, fragrant and exuberant. But the scent of the flowers couldn't disguise the metallic smell of danger that hung in the air. She felt Gustavo's presence, a shadow that stretched into every corner of her life, like an invisible, but deadly, spiderweb. In her garden, illuminated by the faint moonlight, Isabella could feel Gustavo's gaze burning on her back. It was a deadly game, a game of cat and mouse where she was the mouse. And the predators were too, Gustavo's overwhelming and frightening love and the hesitant, yet tender, promise of Daniel's love. Which path to choose, which risk to take? Isabella's heart, an iceberg about to completely melt, beat strongly against her ribs, a symphony of fear, hope, and an immense desire for a future that seemed as distant as the stars in the sky. The moon continued to observe her, a silent witness to her internal struggle, a struggle that would decide her destiny. The destiny of her heart, a heart that longed for love, but that was surrounded by danger. A danger that, with each minute, seemed to draw closer. The night in Acapulco was a veil of mystery, and Isabella felt trapped in its web. Daniel, with his charming smile and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of the sea, made her forget, for a moment, the pain that accompanied her like a shadow. But the shadow of Ricardo, the love of her life, still loomed over her, heavy as an anchor. It was as if Ricardo were there, whispering her name in the night wind, preventing her from completely surrendering to the new flame that was igniting in her chest. With each encounter with Daniel, the fragility of her heart became more evident. It was like walking on eggshells, afraid that the slightest misstep would break the delicate balance she had worked so hard to build. Daniel's touch, soft and hesitant at first, now brought a sensation of warmth that both frightened and comforted her. She wanted to surrender. She wanted to let herself be carried away by the current. But fear paralyzed her, fear of the uncertain future, fear of rejection, and, above all, fear of Gustavo. Gustavo, Ricardo's brother, was the personification of danger. His eyes, dark and piercing, followed Isabella like shadows that sneak into the cracks of the night. He watched her from afar, but his presence was as oppressive as a weight on her soul. Gustavo's love, sickly and possessive, was a burden too heavy for her to bear. He couldn't accept the possibility of Isabella loving another man, of finding a new love after Ricardo's death. For Gustavo, Isabella belonged to him, and only him. A chance encounter, a fleeting glance, a simple touch, each encounter with Gustavo was an electric shock, an injection of adrenaline that left her breathless. It was a love that didn't bring comfort, but rather the constant anguish of a trap. The memory of his touch on her hand still echoed in her body, a shiver that wasn't of pleasure, but of terror. He seemed to feed on her pain, her uncertainty, her fear, and she, caught in a web of conflicting emotions, didn't know how to free herself from his clutches. The joy that Daniel brought her was an oasis in an arid desert, but this oasis was surrounded by dangers. Isabella knew that she couldn't allow herself to live in a bubble of happiness while danger was so close. The flowers that Daniel had sent her, a delicate and affectionate gift, were there in the living room, but she could barely notice their perfume, suffocated by the heavy scent of the threat that hung in the air. It was a woody scent of something old and dark, the scent of Gustavo's obsession. Isabella felt divided. Part of her wanted to surrender to Daniel's love, to embrace the possibility of a new beginning, of a life full of joy and peace. But another part, larger, darker, knew that this love was at risk, that she was walking over an abyss. Gustavo's shadow stretched over her like a dense, suffocating fog, obscuring all the light. She found herself caught in a deadly game, a game where the stakes were too high and where victory seemed farther and farther away. It was a game of cat and mouse, with Gustavo as the patient cat and Isabella as the defenseless mouse. And in the midst of it all, there was Daniel, a ray of hope in the darkness, a fragile yet vibrant hope, a love that she wanted to protect at all costs, but that she knew was in imminent danger. Danger approached, silent as a serpent ready to deliver the fatal strike. The moon, implacable, observed everything, a silent witness to this tragic story of love and obsession. Isabella's decision was about to be made. A misstep could be the end of everything. But in her heart there was a thread of hope, still hesitant, but latent. Doubt, however, was greater than ever. After all, which path would she choose? The imposing and menacing moon witnessed Isabella's internal struggle. Her heart, once an impenetrable iceberg, was now a volcano about to erupt. Daniel, with his gentle smile and deep gaze, had melted part of the glacier that had imprisoned her for a year since the loss of Ricardo. But the shadow of Gustavo, Ricardo's brother, loomed over them, dark and menacing. Gustavo, who had always secretly loved Isabella, a sickly and possessive love, did not accept the possibility of seeing her in another man's arms. It was a struggle between two loves, the soft and hesitant warmth of Daniel and the suffocating and dangerous passion of Gustavo. The white orchids that Daniel had sent perfumed the house, but the sweet aroma was overshadowed by the metallic scent of danger. Isabella felt Gustavo's gaze on her back, even without seeing him. It was as if he were everywhere, an oppressive presence, an invisible web that imprisoned her. She remembered the casual touch of their hands at the supermarket, the electricity that ran through her body, not the tenderness of Daniel, but the fear, the adrenaline of imminent danger. Fear intensified when, as she went out to meet Daniel, she saw him. Gustavo was waiting for her on the corner, his imposing figure, a dark silhouette under the moonlight. He didn't say anything, he just stared at her with eyes of contained fury, a look that carried all his pain, his anger, his sickly obsession. The silence was more menacing than any scream. Isabella felt a lump in her throat, fear paralyzing her. The beauty of the night in Acapulco faded, transformed into a stage of terror. Gustavo's approach was slow, calculated, like that of a snake about to strike. Each step was a hammer blow to Isabella's fragile balance. She was trapped, with no escape, her breath caught in her throat. The promise of happiness with Daniel was a distant dream, a mirage in a desert of fear. What did Gustavo intend? The uncertainty was more frightening than any explicit threat. Isabella tried to retreat, but Gustavo's steps became faster, more insistent. She felt the warmth of his breath on her neck, the weight of his body approaching. The scent of Daniel's orchids was now a distant memory, covered by the oppressive aroma of fear. It was as if the very air was heavy, laden with a mortal threat. Gustavo cornered her against the wall, his icy fingers brushing her arm. The touch was different. It wasn't Daniel's tenderness, it was the coldness of danger. Gustavo's dark eyes gleamed with blind rage, an obsession that consumed his soul. He whispered threatening words in her ear, a veiled promise of suffering if she dared to continue her new relationship. His voice, low and hoarse, trembled with passion and hatred. Isabella struggled to breathe, her body trembling under the weight of the threat. She felt Gustavo's closeness, the intensity of his anger, the sickly obsession that consumed him. The hope of a future with Daniel faded with each second, replaced by the mortal fear that imprisoned her. The moon, now, seemed to be complicit in the tragedy that was unfolding. The night, once romantic, had turned into a nightmare. The scent of flowers, once soft and hopeful, was now obscured by the dense metallic smell of blood, violence, obsession. At that moment, a scream tore through the night. Daniel, who had witnessed the scene, threw himself at Gustavo, pushing him away from Isabella. The two men grappled, in a brutal and wild fight, under Isabella's frightened and helpless gaze. The fight was a deadly dance, a mixture of rage and despair under the implacable moonlight. Isabella, between love and danger, witnessed a confrontation that would decide not only the future of her heart, but her very survival. The night in Acapulco, once serene and romantic, was now a battlefield, the stage for a fight between two men for a single love. And Isabella, in the center of it all, trapped and helpless, awaited the outcome, with her heart in her hand, under the cold and implacable gaze of the moon. The climax of the fight was approaching, defining the destiny of everyone involved. The shadow of Ricardo, a painful past, seemed to loom over the scene like a sinister specter. The fight between Daniel and Gustavo was a whirlwind of punches and kicks, a maelstrom of fury and despair under the implacable moonlight. Isabella, paralyzed by fear, watched the scene as if she were in a horror movie, unable to intervene, trapped between the men's brutal violence and the imminent threat of death. Daniel's athletic and strong body received Gustavo's blows, who fought with the strength of a cornered animal. The two rolled on the grass, a heap of muscles and sweat, in a ballet of violence that left Isabella breathless. She saw blood streaming down Daniel's face, but he didn't give up. His determination was unstoppable, fueled by a newborn love and the need to protect Isabella. Suddenly, Gustavo's body fell heavily to the ground, like a felled tree trunk. Daniel, gasping for breath, breathed deeply, looking at his fallen opponent with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He got up with difficulty, his body ached everywhere, but the adrenaline of the fight kept him on his feet. Isabella ran to him, her trembling hands touching his injured face, tears streaming down her face. The scene was of a tragic beauty, love and violence mingling, the fragility of life exposed in a raw struggle for survival. Daniel, still gasping for breath, hugged her tightly, his body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. He protected her like a protective lion, his love overflowing in the eyes that looked at Isabella. But the tranquility was fleeting. A metallic sound cut through the silence. Gustavo, with a malevolent gleam in his eyes, held a knife, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. He got up, staggering, but determined to carry out his plan. Fear froze Isabella, her eyes fixed on the shining blade. Gustavo's face was a mask of pure hatred, sickly love transformed into a thirst for revenge. Daniel, even injured, prepared to face Gustavo again, but before he could react, Gustavo pointed the knife at Isabella. His lips curled into a cruel smile, and in a fraction of a second, before Daniel could intervene, he disappeared. He simply disappeared. Isabella and Daniel looked at each other in disbelief. The knife fell to the ground with a metallic thud, the only sound amidst the silence that followed, a silence more terrifying than the fight itself. Where was Gustavo? The night harbored more secrets than the ocean. What would become of Isabella and Daniel? The threat had vanished, but fear still remained. The danger continued to loom, invisible, silent, waiting for the opportune moment to manifest itself. Where would Gustavo be? What was his plan? The answer would be left for the next episode. The moon, a silent witness to this tense night, remained implacable, as if it guarded even more secrets yet to be revealed. The shadow of Ricardo, a constant weight in Isabella's life, continued to loom, a bitter memory that now seemed an omen of what was to come. What would happen to Isabella and Daniel? What would Gustavo's next move be? The answer, suspended in the air like an imminent threat, would be left for the next episode.